love that James Stewart quote when he says, God did not conquer despite the dark mystery of evil. God conquers through it. He uses what seems like vulnerability and weakness to actually show his tremendous strength.
This question of, it's all about battles over power. And, it's interesting. One of the strange things about it is as soon as the Kens figure out they have power in the real world, it takes them about 2 seconds to fool all the Barbies in Barbie Land, which again is sort of its own kind of implicit anti-woman, meant like they were just so easily fooled by Ken coming in and saying, hey, we're going to turn everything into trucks and horses. And
the minute that happened, by the way, I remember watching the movie and thinking, they have to address that. That can't just be sitting there, because you're going to leave this movie thinking that the Barbies are all hopeless, helpless, hapless half-wits. They try to explain it by saying that patriarchy is this thing you can either get or catch, apparently, in the Barbie movie. And
it's really massive. What they're saying is masculinity. Is anything masculine is called patriarchy.
And so it's ill-defined, but
stereotypically masculine.
That's what you get the picture of. And I think one of the Barbies, or I think the woman in the real world, who comes to the Barbie land, she says the reason the Barbies were so fooled is because it's like smallpox. When the natives all died of smallpox in North America, it's because they had no exposure to it, no immunity built up. And so the Barbies were so easily fooled into buying into it, which is frankly not, it takes a shot at the idea of patriarchy by calling it a disease, but it also is a very, I think, lazy way to explain the way the Barbies were taken over so quickly. I realize you only have 2 hours to tell a story, and so that's part of it. It's a challenge for a writer, but that is a lazy way to do it.
Well, and why didn't that happen in the real world when men are exposed to feminism? It's not like women suddenly take over the world that it is. So
that's a good point.
It's sort of this, other than, obviously that hasn't happened in the real world, but so that was kind of a strange thing. But this power, what is going on with what did you take away from some of the power struggles, implicit messages, underlying messages about power itself? Obviously, that is such a huge thing that we talk about now. People, redefining history based entirely on issues of who has power and who doesn't, who are the powerful, who are the oppressors, who are the oppressed. And I know you talked about this a bit in your most recent book, More Than a White Man's Religion. How do you see that, the conversation you had in that book, taking place again today in the land of Barbie and some of these other movies we've talked about?
So, and as I talk about in the book, roughly speaking, we are engaged, whether it's the various social theories we have now, in the struggle for power as if it's a zero-sum game. Like, if I have it, you can have none. If you have it, then I can have none. When the reality is that I think the way forward is to struggle to see equality for what it actually is that this is we're in a broken world. And this is another thing that Barbie does sort of well in the end is Barbie meets her creator, not God, but Ruth Handler. Ruth Handler, the ghost of Ruth Handler, says to Barbie, people create the patriarchy and they create things like Barbie in order to deal with a messy, broken world. She doesn't use the word broken, she uses the word messy. But I think that's interesting because I do think some of the social ills we have in our lives, including this struggle for power. And if you have it, then I don't have any of it, so I have to take it from you in order to get it for myself. Or we invent things like postmodernism in order to get rid of power struggles, only to realize we've created post-truth, which is the ultimate power struggle, because we're dealing with a broken world and we're not trying to find a solution outside of ourselves, but within ourselves. And so I think that that's why the Barbenheimer phenomenon is so interesting to me, not because it's two completely different movies that people watch in one day, as if to say, I'm being ironic watching this movie and being serious watching this movie. They're both pretty serious movies about power. And so I think this is poetic that people are going to see two movies about power while they're also wringing their hands over the morality or the issues behind a movie like Sound of Freedom that's about vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a gospel hook here. I really do think there's a gospel hook. And not in a convenient sort of like, oh, I found a way in kind of a thing. I think that there's something powerful here because human beings, through our art, we recognize the human condition and that all of our attempts to fix it, even when we champion those attempts, they're flawed. The Barbie movie doesn't end in any way, shape, or form where we found an answer. All it is an existential, this is the way it is kind of a thing, but let's face it with a smile. At the end of the day, men are still in power in the real world, and women and the Barbies run things in the Barbie land world, and it doesn't really ever get fixed. It's exactly the way it was when it started.
Yeah.
Nothing got better, except that Barbie realized what it means to be human. The reason why I think this is important is not because I can find a hook that's artificial, like I came up with this. The fact of the matter is that the Barbie movie, Oppenheimer, and Sound of Freedom are movies about the fact that the human condition is irrevocably broken. Human beings cannot fix it. And despite our best efforts to create our isms and our schisms and our archies, whatever these things are, unless we see a message from the one by whom, through whom all existence has its being, who comes to fix things in a way for us, because we can't fix it because we are the problem. Until we look at that reality, our movies will reflect over and over again that nothing can be fixed by us because we are the problem. So I think that's why the zero-sum game thing with these power struggles leaves us wanting more, leaves us wondering, well, what next? What now? And one of the things I thought was interesting about the Barbie movie was, and sitting there as a male, it made me uncomfortable, which was its intent. And in that sense, it succeeded. But it went too far because some of the things that are not bad about being male were made to look bad about being male. And what Barbie tries to do, at least to some respect, is to elevate women, but by denigrating men. And I think if you look to Christ and what he did with women, as I document in the book a lot, is Jesus had a way of elevating everyone without denigrating anyone. He calls out sin for what it is. He calls out the sexism of his day for what it was, but he elevated women without denigrating men and challenged men in their sexism, but did it in a way that said, you need to emulate me. Emulate what I do. It's not a zero-sum game. You don't have to lose power to give someone else that power. You need to understand that power for the good of people made in his image, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and there's this, I know that this is a potential to kind of step in it again, but essentially power is this idea that I need to get people to serve me. But Christ comes and says, I came to serve and not be served. And we should all be seeking to serve and to not be served.
Right.
And it's interesting because even in some of the debates in Christian circles, and I'm not going to really talk about the complementarian, egalitarian thing, but it's interesting because one of the things that has crept in is that church leadership is about power. Power is how you gain ultimate validation and value and all these things. And so if someone doesn't have access to that power, you are saying they are lesser. Whereas the head of the church came to serve and not be served, to lay down his life for many and all that. So even in the church, this is we're still in that battle of, instead of sort of, it's almost like what Luther called the theology of glory versus the theology of the cross, right? And so the theology of glory is like Muhammad or Allah, and Muhammad being his prophet, obviously. I don't know if you've heard of this.
I've heard of that.
But
I'm vaguely familiar.
But the idea that God comes and defeats his enemies by basically looking like the rest of the world and using power to do so. But in Christianity, it's quite the opposite. And that's sort of the message of Christianity, is that the way that we do things by these power struggles and constantly just trying to gain sovereignty over other people, which is essentially what happened in the Garden of Eden, this idea that when we eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil from that tree, it is this desire to define good and evil for ourselves and
Mhm.
have this our own sovereignty to be gods. That will always go wrong. And there's something about serving others. And even if you do happen to be, the head of something, it is about serving. I mean, we have this term servant leadership that
Right.
became popular in like 60s or 70s or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And there is no real, I think when I walked away from Barbie, it was this sort of utter lack of a desire to, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but to be in community and to serve one another.
Yeah.
And to just love one another and see how do we, because even in the Bible, when they're talking about differences between men and women in marriage, and everyone focuses on women submit to your husbands, and we think, oh, and there's some debate on, but that does seem to be what it's saying there.
Mhm.
Then right after, it's husbands, have to sacrifice their whole lives for their wives. It's like, this isn't like a power thing. It's been turned into a power thing, which is the unfortunate history
Yeah.
of some of this.
Yeah,
but that's not a power
we're
thing.
responsible for that as well.
Yeah,
We've taken these kind of things and run amok with them, as it were. As in the book, I pointed out that Paul specifically wants people to know, if you're going to use this whole thing about men were created first as a way to lord it over women, don't forget that he says specifically, every man is born of a woman and all things come from God. So you are interdependent and there is mutual submission going on here. And if you miss that, you've missed the whole picture of what it means to have power over each other. It's funny because Diane Langberg in her most popular book, I think to date, speaks about the idea that even the vulnerable have power. Babies have power over their parents. A crying baby in a crib has the power to get the parents out of bed in the middle of the night and tend to the baby's needs. One of the most vulnerable beings in the world has this power by virtue of its cry because of its need. And so that's a poetic picture of the way in which we have to start caring for each other in the sense of understanding our power and our vulnerabilities. And sometimes our vulnerabilities can be our power, which is amazing because this is woven into creation, into a human experience. And it's a shallow and pale reflection, but nonetheless a real reflection of the way God, in fact, saves the world through vulnerability, which is actually the revelation of what true power is and how it can be valuable, because power can be used for ill or it can be used for good. And what the gospel is about is power being used for good through vulnerability and laying down that power, the seeming outward power for the real power that happens, which is why I love that James Stewart quote when he says that God did not conquer despite the dark mystery of evil. God conquers through it. He uses what seems like vulnerability and weakness to actually show his tremendous strength. But that strength exists because of how he helps us who are powerless.
Yeah.